Game number 4 is in the books, and we're going to do a quick recap. We have Magnus with the white pieces, Jan with the black pieces. This game we see e4 by Magnus, switching up from 1d4, which he played in game number 2. We see e5 by Jan, really the most popular move at the top level. We see e5 versus Sicilian quite often. Knight f3, and now here already on move number 2, we get a surprise move by Jan. He plays knight to f6, the Petrov defense. This has been fairly popular at the highest levels recently, especially by Levon Aronin has been playing it quite a bit. And a few years ago, Fabiano Caruana really brought the Petrov back to life. And the Petrov is known as an opening that can tend to be drawish, but it's also very solid, so it's hard for white to play for the win. And I think this surprised Magnus. So they ended up following the main line. Magnus grabs the pawn, d6, he retreats. Knight takes e4, d4, d5. This is all the most popular moves for each side. Bishop d3, bishop d6, castle, castle. And you can see here we have almost complete symmetry. The only difference are the two knights. So here Magnus plays c4. And, excuse me, this is a way to try to open up the center a bit and maybe create an imbalance to play for potential winning chances. c6 was played by Jan. And so far we're following main lines. Rook e1 by Magnus. Rook e1 is slightly less common than the main move, which is knight to c3, but still, this is mainline theory. Now we see bishop to f5 by Jan. There we go, bishop f5. Queen to b3 by Magnus. And what this does is this threatens the capture on b7, and also c takes d5. And Jan plays the best move, queen d7. And this holds everything tactically, so there's not going to be a pawn lost. If Magnus tries to win this d5 pawn, there's bishop takes h2 check, winning the queen. So now we see a couple trades, and this is pretty much forced. Knight takes c3, bishop takes f5, queen takes f5, b takes c3. And after these trades, you can see the c pawn and d pawn are about to swap off. And all Jan has to do is defend the pawn on b7, so he plays pawn to b6. And now this position is very close to equal. And I think the surprise on move number 2, playing knight f6, Petrov defense, has really worked well for Jan. He was able to very comfortably get this equal position, and there's really only an extremely small advantage for white here. And I think it's very hard to prove anything because we're already heading towards an endgame, and black doesn't have any major weaknesses. So Magnus trades twice on d5. This is now the weakest pawn for black, pawn on d5, and Magnus is going to try to apply some slight pressure to this pawn, queen to b5. And so it's still an attempt to play for a win. And the plan is to push the a pawn up the board for white and to play for the queenside play with the queen and the a pawn. Jan plays queen d7. And we're actually following a game between Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and Fabiano Caruana from Norway Chess 2017. And in this position, MVL played rook to b1, but in the game, Magnus chose to play pawn to a4. And both of the moves are still pretty much holding the equal position. Jan decides to trade queens. And the nice thing with this pawn on b5 is it's trying to hold back this pawn on a7, and white wants to make that the weakest pawn on the board. But Jan finds the strongest move, and really this move should be played in order to hold an equal position, pawn to a5. Now if white takes the pawn, black takes back with the knight, you could maybe claim here that white still has a small edge. And I think this was kind of the last chance for Magnus to play for the stockfish edge, according to best play, what's the eval. But in the game, Magnus plays knight to h4. Now, the computer is saying 0.00, so it has it figured out that this game is probably going to be a draw with best play. But stay tuned for the next few moves, because Magnus is going to heat this up a bit and try to create a checkmating net on the king side with this knight h4 idea. So Jan plays g6, blocking the f5 square from the knight. That makes sense. And here Magnus plays pawn to g4, and he has this nice idea, knight g2, bishop f4, and if the bishops trade, the white knight ends up on f4, attacking the pawn on d5. So that's kind of the idea for white, And what Jan has to do here is figure out how can he get developed quickly enough so he can counterattack the white pawns while white's attacking the pawn on d5. So what Jan wants to do is develop the last minor piece. And he plays knight d7, and now he's ready to put a rook on c8 and create some counterplay against the white pawns. So Magnus is going to do this knight g2 bishop f4 idea, and Jan's going to try to attack on the c file. So we see knight g2 by Magnus, rook f c8, and this is perfect timing by Jan, and these trades will help him hold the drawing chances. Bishop to f4, bishop takes, knight takes, and Jan's getting some trades, grabs the c3 pawn, Magnus grabs the d5 pawn. Now interestingly, this is getting a little bit more exciting, and I think if this were a blitz game, or if the players had less time on the clock, maybe there'd be some chances for one side to mess up, because we have a d pawn that's a passed pawn, there's no pawns that can stop it, and an a pawn for black that's a passed pawn. So passed pawns on both sides. That tends to create more winning chances. Rook to d3, attacking this weak pawn. Rook to e7, and it's weak just because there's no pieces defending it currently. And now Magnus goes for kind of this tricky knight scenario. Whenever you see a knight that's roaming around the opponent's position, there's a lot of forks to watch out for. So Magnus is going to use a combination of rook and knight plus this passed pawn to see if he can pose any small problems for Jan in this position. So Jan plays knight to f8. We see knight f6 check, king g7, knight e8 check. So what he's doing here is he's putting the knight on e8 to use tactics to be able to push this pawn. He plays pawn to d5, and there's no rook takes d5 because knight f6 check, winning the rook. So it's a way for Magnus to get this pawn pushing up the board. Now Jan plays a4 though, and look at this a pawn. It's also running up the board quickly, and Magnus does still have to be careful because Jan might get that pawn to a2, play rook b3, rook b1 check, and all of a sudden it's Magnus that's in a losing position. So Magnus plays knight f6 check, and one idea for Magnus here is to play g5, h4, h5, maybe even bring that pawn up to h6 and try to attack with the kingside pawns. So this is a position that could get very interesting if Magnus wants to push for that win. And then here he goes, pawn to g5, defending the f6 knight. Now, can Magnus create a mating net against the black king? That's the question. Jan plays a3, and again, this pawn is getting dangerously close to queening. It wants to go to a2, and rook b3, rook b1. And Magnus spent a lot of time thinking here, and he played knight to e8 check. He had 33 minutes on the clock. Jan still had an hour and 8 minutes, and they need to make it to move 40 to get bonus time. And one thing that I was thinking after knight e8 check is this could be a move just to buy a little bit of time for Magnus. So Jan plays king g8, Magnus plays knight back to f6, king to g7. Now this is the chance. Magnus could play h4, but there's a very nice reply by Jan. He can actually get away with playing h5, and that shuts down the h-file play. Now let's say Magnus wants to play for a win here. He might go pawn to d6, because if rook takes d6, we have knight e8 check, winning the exchange. But now Jan could play knight to h7, offering a trade of the knights, kind of shoring up all the problems over here on the king side. After knight takes h7, king takes h7, you might be thinking, well, what about rook takes f7? Jan can still play safely with king g8, and after this rook moves, Jan can get counterplay on the king side with the rook to a4, hitting the h pawn, which defends the g pawn. So really Jan has enough counterplay. Anything that Magnus can try, Jan has a counter. And the problem is Magnus is getting really low on the clock. He was under 30 minutes at this point. Jan has over an hour. You're not going to trick Jan. And if you're not careful with low time on the clock as Magnus, you might actually blunder yourself. So in the game, he played knight e8 check, king g8, knight back to f6 check, and here the players agreed to a draw. So that's game number 4. We had another draw. We'll see you for the game 5 recap. Thanks for watching.